I think we'll just start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the online summer speaker series of the North American Regional Science Council, or NARSC. This is the third and last talk of the 2020 series. Again, I hope everybody is staying healthy and safe during this challenging time. My name is Haifeng Qian. I'm the chair of NARSC. Today, I'm co-hosting this event with Professor Amanda Winstein from University of Akron. She's also a NARSC counselor. Amanda will lead the Q&A session, so she will say hi to everyone later. Today, we were delighted to have Professor Mark Partridge to speak on COVID-19 and exploring of regional economies. I just want to have a brief introduction of our speaker today. Dr. Mark Partridge is the Swank Chair of Rural Urban Policy at The Ohio State University and is affiliated with GSSI in Italy and Jinan University in China. He has published nearly 150 academic journal articles and 60 other book chapters, briefs, and reports. Dr. Partridge frequently gives presentations and addresses to academics and practitioner groups around the world. Professor Partridge has received research funding from many sources, including the European Union, the U.S. National Science Foundation, the Canadian SSHRC. His research includes investigating poverty, inequality, and regional growth. He's a leading rural policy expert. He's a fellow and president of the Regional Science Association International, and has received a prestigious NARSC Essard and Boyce Awards. He also served as NARSC chair and NARSC president. Dr. Partridge is a fellow and serves as the president of the Southern Regional Science Association. Before Professor Partridge starts his lecture, I just say a few words about the ground rule here. This lecture will be recorded, and a link to the video will be posted on the NARSC website, which is narsc.org. Professor Partridge will speak for about 75 minutes, which will be followed by Q&A. Please post your questions through the Q&A function on the Zoom screen. If you like a question, you can upload it so it can be answered earlier. If you prefer ask questions by voice, you can use the raise hands function of Zoom. But please wait towards the end of the seminar to raise your hand, because we're going to take the Q&A session question first. Without further ado, Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Haifeng. And thank you, Amanda. And it says that I'm Amanda Weinstein, but that's a little bit of a quirk. So I'm happy here to discuss some work that we've been doing. I've been doing with Cindy Schreiner and Sung-Hoon Chung here at Ohio State about COVID-19 and some of the regional impacts, and share some of our early work on this, and also share some of my maybe confusion isn't the right word, but uncertainty of what all of this says, because we have all sorts of things overlaid on regional economies. We have a recession, which has certain predicted effects. We have the very weird supply shock and the shutdown and disruptions in the supply chain, which for the most part seem to have worked themselves out, but are obviously still there because even today we're getting pretty hefty inflation out of the producer price index. How the virus itself, and then that affects people's willingness to shop or work and what have you. Local governments, in particular the federal government's unwillingness to actually do what we all know is necessary to eliminate it, because the ultimate cause of this depression, recession is the virus. And then we have little quirks in the way the unemployment insurance system is working, and the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program for small and medium-sized businesses, that are also creating weird quirks in how people are responding. And all of this is coming together in a way that we've never seen before. So with that, the obvious background, as I just said, that COVID has killed more Americans than anywhere in the world. It's killed more Americans than every war since World War II, not including World War II, but since World War II. Brazil is second in deaths. It has about 2/3 of what we have. And generally, what we had is the United States maybe not quite as dogmatic as the rest of the world, or say Europe and especially China. We've had public health closures, non-essential businesses were closed. However, this varied across states in the length of that. And what we've seemed to have kind of gotten into is a pattern of rolling shutdowns where one part of the country starts shutting down because they were too lax, and they have to start reimposing various kinds of rules, and they slow down, and then they put it out, and then we're going to get another outbreak over here. And all of this is due that we never really had a national response, which of course is different. Dating back to the early 20th century, we had hurricanes and floods, and really the Mississippi flood in 1927 was the breaking point where it was then agreed that national emergencies, national natural disasters had to have a federal response. And indeed, the emergency order the president signed back in March declaring a national emergency, within that law, the statute, is that the federal government is going to coordinate all of this, and that has never happened. And so we've had just ad hoc responses across the U.S. The resulting, at least the initial implosion, was unlike anything that we've seen. I compared it to, I rival it to the Great Depression. However, the response was much faster than the Great Depression. And the Great Depression was a series of fall, you hit a trough, fall, you kind of hit a plateau, and so on. Where this was just an incredible tanking right away. About 1 in 5 workers are collecting unemployment insurance benefits. 13 million Americans have lost their jobs, which is about 8%. That's much more than the trough of the Great Recession. And we have all sorts of things, depending on how you measure it. 30 to 80 million people are food insecure. 30 to 50 million Americans are facing either cannot pay their mortgage or expect that they cannot pay their rent. So we're really facing a lot of issues right now. Just to give you a feel for it, this shows daily deaths on the left and new cases on the right. And you see what makes the U.S. stand out is that if you look at, say, daily new cases, we were basically, if you look through the period through early April, we were tracking along about the same as the European Union was in terms of per capita cases. And then we opened back up. We never really had the major decline. And then we've had it, as we know, beginning in late June, seemingly peaking out around the end of July, another wave of cases, in particular in the Sun Belt. And so just to compare that to Italy, which was held out as an example of the worst case scenario back in the spring, Italy peaked out in late March and has since pretty well contained the virus. And this would be pretty much the story across all of the advanced world, that we pretty much, it's contained everywhere but the United States. So given that, what has it done to the economy? If you look at the 50 largest metropolitan areas, that would be anything from a little over 1 million to 19 million. At the peak, the losses were across those 50 MSAs, 20 to 75% of small business employment. In the last 10 days of April is when we started to experience recovery. First, there was a little bit of stimulus with the tax rebates, and then also beginning of reopening. However, the way this is diffused across the country has been different in a sense that the typical recession dating back to the Great Depression was that the industrial Midwest was the hardest hit, led the country into recession due to its heavy manufacturing concentration, and then it would disperse out from there. And in this time, it began more in the Northeast, but then as we had rolling outbreaks, say in the Sun Belt, its effects have moved elsewhere. And so the virus is produced this really unusual set of dynamics that it's hard to, it's still hard to figure out exactly how this is going through, how regional economies are experiencing a shock and how this will be dissipated through the system. So basically, people have pointed out that this pandemic potentially will lead to massive changes. And in particular, if we don't get any stimulus here, where we have a legitimate moratorium on foreclosures and rent moratorium, and we don't have an increase in the unemployment insurance, we're going to have a lot of unhappy people. And what's different so far is that the workers generally hurt in recessions are men. Men are usually hit hardest because they're disproportionately manufacturing, disproportionately in mining, and disproportionately in the goods sector. That's not the case this time. Women are disproportionately affected. This one is this one is hitting Black Americans in terms of the disease. But as I'll show you, in terms of racial composition, it's a pretty weird effect. And a lot of that has to do with the virus itself, the unemployment insurance system, and the way this is rolling out. Young workers tend to do worse compared to prime age workers. That may not be true here, in that young workers, maybe it's evidence consistent with this. Young workers appear to be, well, the virus is less of a threat to me, and they're more akin to work because they feel less at risk. And that might be the explanation for my daughter. She's taken a job that I wish she hadn't, but it's a pretty high risk job. And then older workers are responding a little bit different, in that usually older workers are a little bit less hit, though when they are hit, it's challenging. But this time they seem to be hit more because they're less inclined to want to go work. Likewise, typically in a recession, we get skill hoarding. In other words, firms don't want to lay off their most skilled workers because they don't want to have to retrain a whole new set of workers. And in this case, that may not be the case because of the differing responses to, due to risk. Likewise, we had in some industries, like delivery industries, we've had massive increases in hiring of generally less educated workers and so on. And so what it's leading to is this weird dynamics in terms of what we've ever faced in the past, is that less skilled workers appear to be working. They appear to be working, but they can't work remotely, unlike most of us. And for that reason, while they're working, they're facing a lot more risk. Small businesses, as I'll talk about, is that in regional economics, regional science, that's a really important issue. Is that a host of literature, by people like Stefan Getz, and his co-authors are Heather Stevens or Stefan Weiler and others, showing that small businesses, entrepreneurship, new businesses are disproportionately important in net job creation. And to the extent that we weaken entrepreneurial spirits, which has been the long run trend since the late 1970s, this really hitting small businesses disproportionately hard is a challenging. Another feature of small businesses is, though the unemployment insurance program has been loosened up with the pandemic unemployment assistance in the CARES Act, until now, the negotiations with that, small business workers tend to be a little bit more informally involved in the economy, less likely to have met the requirements. You have to have a work history historically to qualify for unemployment insurance, so their workers are less likely to get it. And then small businesses were supposedly to be helped by the Paycheck Protection Program, a loan program, where around 40% of the loan can be forgivable if they don't lay off any workers. And as I'll show you, if the goal was to stop small businesses from laying off workers, the program has failed. It's not the way, it's a very indirect way of doing it, unlike Europe, where the government through the firm is directly paying to keep people employed. Okay, so just first, let me just mention some of the weird aspects of the pandemic unemployment assistance. It was, until it ended at the last week of July, $600 extra a week. Unlike past unemployment insurance, it covers the self-employed, it covers the gig economy. And this weekend, President Trump issued an executive order which would continue this for, really continue it for about 2 months, given how much money is there. But it's $300 a week, federal government, plus an additional $100 a week from the states. But as I'll talk about, the states don't have any money for that. And it pretty much gets rid of the gig economy, people that drove Uber or whatever, the people who had more informal work relationships, because the Trump executive order it received the $300 a week federal and supposedly it's $100 a week state. You had to have been earning $100 in state unemployment. So it's much less of a boom in there. And given that the rest of the stimulus is worn out, we really need some sort of stimulus. In particular, state and local governments are, for the most part, are expecting some relief and have only laid off about 1/8 of their state and local workforce. However, that's, if they don't get the relief, that's going to end. So that right now is, Congress is all tied up and with the president, and we desperately need them to do something. And then the other thing I just want to mention, I take this as a grain of salt, and that is that a lot of people have talked about how cities are going to become unattractive because of COVID. And certainly right now, I wouldn't want to be living in Manhattan or other dense cities at the moment. But, the same kind of things were said after 9/11. One could have drawn a similar conclusion from the Spanish flu. In other words, these kind of events, sometimes people think that you're going to have much longer effects than what will actually be there. So I'm right now skeptical that unless we get pandemic after pandemic after pandemic, that it's really going to change our urban structure. So this just shows here unemployment insurance claims, peaking at around 7 million in late March. They're still at over 1 million, 1.1 million, 1.2 million per week, which is almost double the all-time record unemployment insurance claims ever, which was back in the 1982 recession, 81, 82 recession. So we're having an amazing number of unemployment. And then the dark red, that's the pandemic unemployment assistance for like self-employed workers, gig workers, workers who would normally not qualify for unemployment insurance. So just to give you a feel, for small businesses, this is from Homebase. And I'm sure many of you have seen this, and at least seen the data referred to. And Homebase has 100,000 firms across the country. It's a human resources payroll program. And so it is normally for small businesses because it doesn't cost much or it's even free. And so what you see is that in early April, small businesses employment and hours worked were down about 80%. And then they seem to have recovered by mid-June to about 20%. But since then it's stalled. And this is the stall that we have noticed since mid-June, that the national economy stalled out. And if we don't get further stimulus, we're probably going to start deteriorating. And just to give you, across some industries, this is small. Food and drink, restaurants, the same kind of pattern, down 80%. At its peak, down 25% today, paused out. Retail, less of a fall, it was down 70%. Today, it's down about 10%, but again, the pause since mid-June. Home repair, those were usually declared essential businesses, like air conditioning and so forth. where that would not have been considered essential in most countries. It was down around 30% at its peak, and today it's down around 5%. The one that's still suffering the most is beauty and personal care. You know, your hair salons and nail places and so on. They were down nearly 90% at its peak, and today they're still down around 40%. And if anything, they've fallen off. They have just paused. They're starting to fall again. And healthcare and fitness. So this, unfortunately, they lumped them together. It has fitness centers and healthcare facilities. And you see that fitness centers, of course, have struggled, but also small healthcare facilities have struggled because of a lot of people either they weren't doing elective kinds of surgery or procedures, or they're afraid of even going in to seek medical care. So that's small. Point was, though, I should say about these small businesses is it shows that if the goal of the PPP program was to help small businesses, it's been a big failure. It has not worked. Okay, just by industry, this is now national. So we got the big firms and small firms. This is the monthly change from March compared to February, 0.7% total. In April, it was down nearly 14%. The recovery, so to speak, it was down by only 12% in May, 8% in June. Now just under 8%. But that's total non-farm employment today. What is different about the COVID recession is that unlike the other ones where manufacturing be heavily hit, and then the pain would be spread out from manufacturing's down, not even down 5%. Even motor vehicles, which for various reasons, the industry shut down because they wanted to draw down inventories. That also meant the auto suppliers, the parts manufacturers shut down. And, given that they have a stronger union, they're more inclined to shut down individual plants if there's a breakout. And so even there, it's only 9%, where in the past, manufacturing industries would have been leading this thing down. Where we're being pulled down by is services in general. Not so much retail trade, as you see, around 4%, or transportation around 8%. It's coming across industries like information, which I'm going to guess that a lot of the workers were working on contract and so forth, and were no longer needed, or no longer wanted. You see temporary help down 17%. Another sign of that. Hospitality, which was down 50%, is still down 19%. Government also pulling us down. The government by itself is down nearly 12%, but the federal government's up only almost 3%. A lot of that census work is temporary, but it's up. But state and local governments are down by about 1/8. And local governments are down by about 1/7. And a lot of that's being buoyed up because state and local governments are hopeful that they'll at least get some support from the federal government because the loss of funding is due to COVID. And if they don't get it, that's going to turn in from a small river to a massive ocean of job losses. Okay, so where is it? Okay. Nationally, that's kind of where the industry, so typically what we would expect is the typical recession from Western New York, Western PA, West Virginia, through the Midwest. That's where recessions were typically the worst, hit the hardest. And then there'd be other places like North Carolina tends to get hit a little bit hard because it's a lot of low-wage manufacturing, and some of these other southern states as well have a lot of low-wage manufacturing. They also tend to get hit. This one has been more concentrated in the Northeast because that's where, at first, the virus was really hit. And this is through June, February through June. That's because the latest numbers we can get at the state and metro level is through June. We'll get more numbers at the end of August. That'll be through July. But you can see that this is a lot more dispersed. Hawaii with its massive tourism industry, Nevada with its large tourism industry, Florida with a tourism industry, and a state that has not handled the virus in what would be considered best practice. They're also greatly suffering. And in my beloved Ohio here, you see we're doing a little bit worse than average. We're around 10% job loss since February. But relative to where normally the Midwest is, because this isn't a manufacturing-led recession, the rest of, the Midwest is not the worst. It's more in places that have a lot of tourism and so forth. What about so what I showed you here is what's going on through June. But I want to show you some of the dynamics across states. And I know that's a busy graph, but this is back to small business employees. So Arizona is the lightest color, and it's down. Their small business employment is down 40%. Why did I pick, Arizona's the lightest, they're down about 30%. Why did I pick Arizona? Because Arizona, you can see Arizona starting to fall off. Arizona had a massive COVID spike. They had to start shutting things down. Texas, here in the darkest color, things seem to be going okay in early June. Since then, falling off. They had a big COVID spike. New York, massive COVID spike, down almost 80%. Steady improvement, but still, New York's slow. Their small businesses are, how many of them are going to come back? New Jersey's the good story, the one that if you shut down and handle it right, they had heavy losses at first, but if you notice New Jersey, it comes up to about minus 10%. New Jersey, among these states, even though they had one of the worst outbreaks of them in New York, their small businesses have done better than average in terms of recovery. My point is what I'm trying to show you is you see certain states recovering differently, which is always the case, but how the virus in states like Arizona and Texas all of a sudden comes along in a state that states that seem to be doing okay, say back in May, relatively okay, and now they're doing worse again. And then if you look at selected metropolitan areas, just a similar, I picked out a similar group. I picked out, my home, Columbus, Ohio, which is one of the best in the country. Hardly any fall off in small businesses today. We've almost entirely recovered. We'll see how long that continues. Well, San Jose here is still down over 20%. San Francisco down here in purple is still down over 40%. And that's where I was getting at, though I don't fully understand why technology is doing particularly bad, but the places where heavily concentrated technology are not doing so well. One explanation could be, as Chetty et al. And others have noticed, where you have the most affluent people, the wealthiest people, they've cut back spending the most. They're not going out to dinner and other kind of leisure and entertainment, and that is jobs for a lot of lower income people that are then being hit. Okay, so then what we have is Miami in the dark green and Houston in the purple. And we see, Houston, falling off. It's just starting, it peaked in mid-June. Miami peaked a little bit later in June, but since it's fallen off, and as far as this data goes up to August 2nd, August 3rd. The point is that we're getting these dynamics we've never seen across the economy where, I know it's not that hard to understand, but where the virus hits, we have a downfall. And where the virus hits next, we'll have another downfall. And because it's difficult to predict where the virus will be next, because that's an outcome of people's behavior of wearing masks and social distancing and governments closing down certain kinds of businesses. It's hard to predict how this will head. And then you throw on it that Congress and the president have been dysfunctional it seems like the administration just lacks the human capital to really understand what to do in a recession. And say in the House, mostly just kind of fecklessness, we're not getting anywhere. Okay, so unemployment rates coming back to the industrial Midwest, it's just because they usually lead the country in a recession. Here in Ohio, well, we're not doing great, but we usually have the worst unemployment by now, and that's not the case. A place like West Virginia usually has the near the worst unemployment. Kentucky's usually not doing real well, and in fact, right now, whether you use, depending whether you use seasonally adjusted or seasonally unadjusted, I'm using seasonally unadjusted because I think seasonality is not particularly helpful in the COVID recession. Kentucky has the lowest unemployment rate. And the one pattern that does hold is the Great Plains states that you almost always have the lowest unemployment rate, and today at the moment they do. But we see states that like Hawaii and Nevada and then that are doing terrible, and we see states like North Carolina, which often somewhat struggles in a recession, doing okay. So the normal patterns are just up to now not holding at all. And then you have a state like Maine, which I should mention. Maine is, they're at risk because everybody else still has the virus, but Maine is, nearly eradicated it, and they benefit from having the lowest unemployment rate. The best way to get your economy going is get rid of this virus. Okay, so just looking at some rural-urban splits, here's my state of Ohio. And again, this is so weird. So normally you would see really high unemployment up in the northeastern part of the state and in places like Toledo. Okay, you kind of got that, but not so much. You got Akron not, doing all that bad. And Columbus would be relatively low, which is the truth, holding. And Cincinnati kind of in the middle between Columbus and Cleveland. And then down here in Appalachian, Ohio, it's rural area that historically was natural resource dependent, historically had manufacturing, poor, low educated, typically has very high unemployment rates in economic downturns. They've had the least unemployment in terms of unemployment insurance claims. While over here in the Northwest, this is farm country. This is, corn and beans. And it's had the most uninsurance claims, which is not typically the case. My point is that this recession is, hitting places hard that traditionally aren't hit, and not hitting places hard that are traditionally hard hit. Okay, then, because I want to talk about it for a little bit, we're going to come back to small firms. As I said, we know innovation, people, like Hai Feng introduced me and others, and this, I can go on with all the people that have looked at this. That's an important generator of economic activity and innovation, and one of the things that has held back us here in the Rust Belt is the lack of new firm generation. And if you look at the Western U.S., this is small firm share. But if you also look at new firm starts, the Western U.S. tends to be more dynamic and has been a little bit more prosperous in the last 25 years or so. So, I'm just trying to point out the importance and how it varies across states. But what's happened to business startups? And they've been crazy. And I don't know what to make of it. And this is from Fred, the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis's, and they get from the census every week, and this is all the way through the end of July. They're getting, just a little bit of a lag. They're getting from the Census Bureau, for whenever you apply for a firm identification number for taxes, you have to fill out this form for the census. And the census has you have to tick a bunch of stuff on the form. One of them is are you a new corporation? And we know that people ready to jump the hoops for a new corporation, they're probably more likely to survive just through self-selectivity. And likewise, there's certain kind of small businesses, given their characteristics, even if they don't incorporate, they will also likely survive. And so from the census, they say high propensity business applications. These are businesses that have a likelihood of actually employing people and have some potential of surviving. Well, at first, they almost went off the scale. If you look at United States, then I have Georgia and Florida, they're down almost 50% in the US and when we got into March. But as you noticed, they were double in early July. In particular, Georgia, since coming down some, but one is that people are saying, kind of a Schumpeterian kind of response, creative destruction. This is a great time to start a business because your competition got wiped out in the downturn. It's less expensive to hire workers and so on. Okay, it's Schumpeterian. But on the other hand, is it some sort of quirk related to other kinds of behavior? And so that's what's going on right now. Okay, given that a lot of talk, background, I'm now going to do some tentative empirical analysis, and I use some data from the Opportunity Insights team. That's Chetty, Friedman, Hendren, Steppner. There I have their website, and they have unemployment insurance claims for much of the United States. And what we're going to do is benchmark those claims, those weekly claims, and this is at the county level, to January and February average. And it doesn't matter if it's a January, February average. It could be just January or what have you. But that we benchmark it. So if it's a 10, if the number is 10%, that means it's 10% higher than the January, February average was for that county. Then we do the same for county, where we look at daily credit and debit card spending relative to January. Likewise, we look at low-income employment and low-income earnings. Employment different than earnings, and it's daily and weekly data. It turns into weekly data in mid-July. Daily before that, and low income is defined by Opportunity Insights as median after-tax income less than or equal to $20,000. So that's pretty low income. Small business openings and revenue. It's a daily data. And then I'm going to start off with, not that this isn't the point of the paper, but it's the point of showing all these interactions of the disease and the unemployment insurance system and the spatial pattern of it going across the country and with the disease. And I'm going to just take a look at time spent away from home and time spent at work relative to where they were back in January and very early February. Then I have it's a basic difference model where I have a dummy variable for any day after 3/13, March 13. That was when the President Trump declared the national emergency. And then I have these variables that are main terms, the main independent variables. Then I interact them with COVID. So in other words, I'm trying to find, I won't show you the main effects. They're not very interesting. But what I want to find out is when COVID hit, what kind of places were hit harder by COVID? And so I have population density, educational attainment relative to university, racial composition variables, the percent employment that's 18 to 25 and over 55, where, as I told you, 18 to 25 normally are hit hard, but they're less at risk in a statistical sense, though I don't think I'd want to deal with it if I was them. Or older workers, which they're not necessarily hit the hardest, but when they are hit in a standard recession, it's a really hard haul to try to get employed. But this time, they may not want to work. We have the self-employment share because self-employment is an important variable. And unlike most recessions, they can draw unemployment insurance. It's coming from the ACS, so that means it's that their primary job occupation is self-employment, not that they do this and get a $10 honorarium and that counts as self-employed. That's their primary job. We have some employment shares by major industry. Then we have the share of employment by firm size, where over 500 is the emitted group. And so by industry, I've already talked about how I would expect leisure and entertainment industries, that if you have a high share of that, you're going to be hit harder. And if you have small firms, you're potentially hit harder as well. And likewise, these are measured in terms of levels for 2019. And so here's the model. Here's the dummy variable after COVID. Here's just the main effect variables. They're the 2019 values of the variables I just described. And then here's the interaction of after the COVID emergency with the X variables. Then we have a time dummy, which is either weekly or daily, depending on how I describe the data. At our first pass, which I'm not, we're checking right now, because we were doing everything's relative, our dependent variables are relative, UI relative to January and February. In other words, the fixed effect in the denominator offsets the fixed effect in the numerator. And in all of these, at least in terms of levels, your fixed effect would be gone. We can't control for county fixed effects as we control for variables, fixed monetary variables that don't change over time. We could control for state fixed effects, and that's what we are actually doing right now. Okay, so given that, first variable I want to talk about, this is not the purpose of this discussion, is the percent away from time. And today, or percent away from home, that dropped to a little over 20% in mid-April. It's come back to around 10%, the latest number. That people are spending about 10% less time away from home. And this here is the percent at your workplace, which bottomed out at nearly 50% in mid-April. Today, it's about 31% below. So we have, first, a lot of 8% fewer people are working, as I've already said, nationally. Plus, we have people like most of us who are working at home, as we can telecommute. And so we have us, we tend to be high-skilled workers, and low-skilled workers are generally, they have to go work. So, but they also have historically very generous unemployment insurance. So I don't want to spend, this is not the point of it, but I just want to show you the weird patterns we get. So not surprisingly, we get less time spent away from home. It's more negative. We have bigger declines in spent away from home in cities. And even in non-metro, we get a little bit of an urban effect, even for the non-metro ones. And then time spent away from the workplace, the more dense your place is, the less time you're spending at the workplace, even in small non-metro areas. And that could be that the kind of work is, you can telecommute. It also is, in general, picking up that the denser the city, the more time you're spending mitigating the effects of that. Then this gets at historically, less educated people are hit harder in recession. This one is different. First, they're getting generous unemployment insurance compensation, so you would think that, okay, they may not want to work, though there's no jobs out there. That's probably, that supply effect's probably small, at least right now. But on the other hand, they have to go into work if they are working, and they tend to be a little bit younger. And we see that less educated people are spending less. They're spending less of a negative effect on how much time away from home and time away from work. And the same with some educated, some college, I should say. So it's unlike where, if we were going to look at this in a normal recession, where university educated people would be the least affected, in this case, it's the less educated people. Likewise, in terms of racial effects, we know that the virus has hit African American communities hardest, and then Hispanic communities as well. But perhaps one of the reasons why is that they're forced to work. They're spending more time at work. Where in the typical recession, they're typically hit harder, and we would probably find a negative sign on them. Things like immigrants are more, where there's more immigrants, you see a bigger negative effect. And I don't know if that was because they're the first laid off, or they live in more dense housing and hence are more at risk. I'm not sure, but we see that effect. The other feature that's going on that we also could be seeing, like over in here, time spent at the workplace, is, it's also being affected that affluent areas cut back their spending the most, and areas that are least affluent actually haven't, because it's necessity spending, and they received historically a relatively generous unemployment insurance. So self-employed people, despite the fact they're covered by UI, they're less affected by this. Places that have a lot of self-employment. Now that could be anything from, say, a Stefan Getz hypothesis. If he was here, Stefan is showing that places with more self-employment tend to be more resilient. And that could be, they're more resilient, they can adjust to a virus. Or it could be that maybe some of them work at home. I mean, this is very difficult to say. Manufacturing, despite not being a manufacturing recession, places with more manufacturing, you see a more negative adjustment. And also in arts and entertainment and leisure. Then the other one is, this comes back to where you have little bitty firms, less than 20 workers, you have, especially in cities, you have more people staying home more. They're not leaving their house, and they're spending less time at work. And this is getting at what I was showing you, that small firms, especially the smallest, whatever protections we put in, we thought we were getting, the paycheck protection program was ineffective if the goal was to help them. Okay, so my point is after all of this, it's not, I'm an economist, not somebody trying to study where people are during the day. However, you can see just this weird patterns. If you've looked at recessions your entire life, you're not getting what you would expect. Okay, so then turning to now, what I am interested in, this is consumer spending. So it fell by over 30%. This is credit card and debits. By early August, they were down 8%. And if we look at those regressions, we see the main point that in particular cities, I should say aggregate spending's over here. In particular, cities seem to be hit the hardest. Though, we even see a little bit of that in in non-metro areas. And in terms of unemployment insurance claims, definitely cities got hit, got hit the least. So cities got hit the hardest in terms of the disease, but they had the fewest unemployment insurance claims in a relative sense, all else equal. I'm not sure if that's because there's more informal employees or what have you, but that's not the result you would expect. But on the other hand, so fewer unemployment insurance claims, but they're spending less money. That's not exactly what you would figure. Likewise, education, we don't see, this is relative to college graduates, we don't see a big high school dropout effect. Some college we see fewer, but it's not the normal education effects that we would see. In terms of spending, where you have more high school dropouts, you've actually had spending doing better. And the same for some college. It goes back to, that's unusual. That's not what you would expect in a recession. And it goes back to, well, it's not that the highest employed have cut back, are not working, it's that they're not spending money. And here, as I already said, well, blacks seem to be working, but also they are drawing more unemployment insurance claims, but Hispanics are not. But not really, at least with blacks, an effect on aggregate spending. And then just coming down to the youth, in unemployment insurance claims, youth are not applying for it, which is not unexpected. They're informally employed. Older workers, not necessarily unexpected, aren't applying for it. But in terms of spending, even though they're not applying for unemployment insurance, their spending is not necessarily being affected. The youth spending is not necessarily being affected. Well, we do see a little bit of cutback where there's older workers. Point is, very weird, very weird. Unemployment insurance claims. Self-employed workers normally can't get it. This time they can. More self-employment insurance claims, but no effect on spending. Manufacturing, not surprisingly, more UI claims because they're more formally employed, and spending negative. Arts and entertainment, of course, more UI claims, but less spending. And then getting to small businesses, they're really getting hit hard. And this is another example. Not only are they closing, places with more small businesses, you're getting fewer unemployment insurance claims because they tend to be less formally involved in the labor force. So it doesn't matter how you cut it. This is a small business recession and somewhat of a service recession. And then the last one is what about low-income workers? And low-income workers, this only goes through June. They expect an update on the 13th. And you see through June, these low-income workers, they were down 38%. Their earnings were also down about 38%. So here's employment, here's earnings for total U.S., metro, non-metro. I'm only going to look at earnings because they're the same results here. Again, low-income people in cities are being especially hit hard. That I think is a response to the virus with a little bit of high-income people cutting back. But again, where you have a lot of high school graduates and some college, they're not necessarily, their earnings are not necessarily worse. And the point being is that, yes, they are being hit in cities. However, it's the wealthy cities where they're really being hit hard, low-income workers. Blacks, again, this weird pattern of blacks not following what you would expect. They're actually maintaining their low-income earnings share and employment. And then if we look at young workers, more young workers, they're willing to go out and work. because they're less at risk. They have higher shares, and in older workers, more mixed results. Where in general, I haven't talked about it because I'm going to run out of time. Once in a while, especially with the older workers, but on some of these results, you'll see kind of that's what is consistent with that story. I want to be careful because it's more like the level of a journalism at the moment, but the story where in rural areas, there was at least more skepticism of the disease, but also that kind of makes sense in the sense it's less densely populated. And you'll see a rural-urban split in that sense where you'll see older workers hit less hard in rural areas potentially because of something like that. Okay, so in terms of industry, more manufacturing, the more low-wage earners got hit, and not surprisingly, the more food processing. You do get that effect, but also some public employment. But unlike the other results, this surprised me just because the smallest firms pay all else equal less than the largest firms. We don't really see much of a firm size effect. So that's one of the areas that small firms, though generally that's places with a lot of small businesses, got hit hardest, as I was trying to show you. And also trying to make a point, if they permanently close down because PPP has been a disaster, that's going to really forebode a sluggish recovery unless we get some sort of Schumpeter and creative destruction that we didn't see from the Great Recession or in its wake. Okay, small business revenue, again, it's down, it bottomed out around 40%. It was down around 19% at the end of July. Very similar pattern. Small businesses were hit the hardest in cities. This is small business openings. This is small business revenue. They're hit hardest in the cities. But where you have less educated workers, small businesses did better. Again, that could be because the affluent were the ones who cut back spending, and less educated workers had a $600 a week UI. But that's certainly not the normal pattern I would have expected. Black shares positive, again, not the normal pattern you'd expect. Immigrant share, at least in terms of revenue, the more immigrants, the harder your revenues got hit. I already said that immigrants appeared to have been hit harder in terms of not working. Also, immigrants tend to be, as almost all of us know, tend to be disproportionately likely to own a small business, and to the extent that their small businesses were potentially hit the hardest. And if you have a lot of old workers, your small businesses got hit the hardest. And I think that is a response to the virus. That age group is starting to get more concerned about their health. And so, as you can see, we get all these demographic shifts and that normally just don't happen because of the way this is coming about. And self-employment, positive, more self-employment, more openings. Again, self-employment's a different, it's not all small businesses. They could be incorporated as well. But they have been a little more resilient, at least. In the same story, if you have a lot of leisure and entertainment, you got really hit hard. But firm size doesn't seem to matter with small business openings, which surprised me. So what's the upshot of all of this is that maybe many of you will have great ideas here in a Q&A, but at least in my past, I have never seen a more unexpected set of results. It is nothing like any recession before. We see very little of the demographic patterns we see out of previous recessions. And then we see it funneling through industries in a way that we normally don't see. Not normally through through arts and entertainment. It's usually manufacturing's driving it. We're seeing interactions with unemployment insurance, that it's affecting people's incentives. We're seeing the disease affect whether the young workers feel less at risk. We're seeing than older workers. We're seeing more affluent people not cutting back their spending, which means that's going to spill over and affect people who provide services to the more affluent. Where normally the most affluent are they're the least likely to cut back their spending. So this, and then I throw in the final one is then going forward, we don't know what's going to happen with the stimulus. I mean, it's obvious what we need to do. It's obvious. However, we need to keep stimulating at least until this virus is under control, and we don't know if we're going to actually, maybe beginning tomorrow, we'll start taking steps on a national basis to eliminate the virus, but we don't know that. So where we're going to go, where we're going forward, it's the hardest situation I've ever seen in that. Outside of saying that, the only thing that seems to be there is that it's always good to have a lot of self-employed people. That entrepreneurship and diversity in firm size seem to help. Okay, so on that, I think I'm going to stop there and turn it over to some comments or questions. So I really appreciate you taking this in today.
Thanks, Mark. So we're open to the Q&A. So if you can post some questions in the Q&A, I'm going to selfishly start with my question. So I was listening to you and doing a little work on recessions. A lot of the previous recessions, we've seen that they've reinforced pre-existing trends. If you relied too much on manufacturing, which we've seen a long-term decline in employment, that recession hit you especially hard, as you mentioned. Where this, as you were talking about, is completely the opposite. We don't see it reinforcing these pre-existing trends. If anything, it seems to be hitting places hard that we're doing well on these pre-existing economic trends, having a lot of service employment, transitioning to this service economy. So what do you think that says in terms of, the long-term recovery, if it's completely disincentivizing the things that should be incentivizing having this service employment?
Well, that's a great question. Let's say it's a brutal road ahead of us. In other words, we don't get rid of the virus, we don't stimulate the economy, then this is going to trickle into manufacturing. And manufacturing will then really take a beating because, as we know, manufacturing being, it's often durable investment that people cut back first, or a durable purchase like a car, they cut back first. And so far, auto sales and housing has held up pretty well. So I think if this continues, it's a hard, brutal recovery. It is going to spread into manufacturing, and it will increasingly look like the traditional recession. However, if we do the right things, we cut some checks and keep unemployment insurance generous for a few more months, and then get rid of the virus. I actually think because it's in the industries that you pointed out that were generally doing fairly well, I think that they can bounce back. It's going to be painful. We lost a lot of small businesses, but then there's going to also be opportunities for new small businesses to open. And so because they are in the leading industries, I think we can bounce back pretty well. As I showed you, as you agree, San Francisco and San Jose are really struggling right now, and we wouldn't expect that to continue forever. So I think a lot of it has to do with how severe this is. The longer it goes on, the more it'll be start looking traditional, and also the more dire the situation will get. I mean, we'll have the W recovery.
So I'm going to switch over to some questions that we're getting in the Q&A. So we had one question about stockpiling. So we also saw the news stories about people buying tons of toilet paper to start off the the shutdowns and everything that happened. How do you think stockpiling is affecting, spending in the pandemic?
I think where it mattered was where it mattered the most was it really messed up the supply chain. In other words, we look at the toilet paper example, and I can show you rolls of toilet paper that would impress you, Amanda, here at my house. Where it messed up the supply chain, as we know, is this consumer production of toilet paper was overwhelmed, and firm commercial toilet paper, there was no demand for it, and there was no reason for some commercial toilet paper supplier to totally revamp their factory to satisfy a temporary demand for consumer goods. And we could see the same like in the agriculture supply chain, where we had, it was disrupted and so forth. I think the question is it was part of the supply chain disruptions were part of the initial problems that made this, we had that big drop in April and May, early May. Coming out of it, we have seemed to have done better. We've, to the extent that people now don't spend any more money because they have enough toilet paper for the rest of their life, at least on the supply chain side, we're doing much better. So I think I'm optimistic it's not going to have a huge effect outside of some consumer goods that, toilet paper sales were great. They're not going to be so great here going forward. So I'm optimistic it's not a big effect.
All right, so we've got a couple questions related to government and government effectiveness in addressing what's going on in the pandemic. And so specifically thinking about when we look at the differences happening, whether it's rural, urban, across states, across counties, how much of this is affected by government and the choices that policymakers have made, but also how do we, especially since you're seeing this recession so different than other recessions, how much of this is really caused by failures in government? And that if this is caused by failures in government, how much can a stimulus really affect the failures that government and policymakers have made?
Well, I think when you look at this chart here, this chart showing the United States, where we were about at the European Union level in early April, at least on a per capita basis. They have about 100 million more people, and this was what Italy was doing, which was the worst country in the world at the time, and they've almost eliminated, and so have almost all the other developed countries. Canada's almost got rid of it, and so on. You'd have to. It's pretty easy to draw the conclusion that the United States response has been, I think it's fair to say, disastrous, and we're not going to get a recovery until we get rid of the virus. So in that sense, just the collapse of basic public health that everybody else in the world can do better than us has been a problem. Just obvious things like we obviously needed mask mandates. We just need them. That's just how you deal with pandemics and so forth. There's no freedom issue. I don't have freedom to drive drunk on the road. I don't have freedom to wear a mask in a pandemic, but not wear a mask. Then in terms of policy decision and in terms of economic policy, the Fed has done as good a job as you can expect. They only have limited levers. They only can affect the financial markets. But what they did was fast and strong. And they came in, and there were a lot of markets like the municipal bond market that was on the verge of collapse in March, that they came in there and provided liquidity. So that's done great. They get an A+. Now, the federal government, in terms of their fiscal policy response, I gave them, at first, in March, in April, I would have gave them a C-. in the sense that the unemployment insurance, making that more generous, $600 a week, that was good. It would have been better if they would have done the way Europe does it, especially how Germany showed that it works so well, is that you use the unemployment insurance system basically to subsidize workers' wages so nobody's laid off. And then we would have been just stuck, we would have been stopped in place and not have all these people, this total disruption where businesses close and people aren't working and so on. Then likewise, so the PPP program, so the unemployment insurance, okay, I'll give that a B, but they could have done better. And now that it's ended, it's obvious we need to extend it the way it was, and that's not happening. There's no issue of disincentive. There's only 5 million jobs available. We got 30 million people unemployed. We shouldn't be worried about disincentives. This is not the time about a disincentive to work. That's a foolish issue at the moment. It will be one, but not one now. And then on the PPP program, I showed you. If the goal was to help small businesses, it's failed. It's failed, and it's been a really expensive failure. And it's had, looks like they're going to be enough to keep inspector generals busy for the rest of their lives in terms of fraud and corruption. So overall, the government, the fiscal policy has been a disaster. So that's my view on that. So we've failed on the public health at the federal, especially the federal, but also state. We can look at what they did in New York, and thousands of New Yorkers died because of bad state policy. And then on the fiscal level, the federal government's utterly failed.
What's your sense about how much of this recession is caused by governments basically shutting down, right? And so you have these drops in spendings and you have this, huge unemployment because we shut down, and it was the government shutting down and not necessarily, the virus. Yes, the shutdown was in response to the virus, but how much was really government created rather than virus created?
You mean the government shutting down the economy, or do you mean the government shutting down the government?
So I think the question really is regarding like the government shutting down the economy rather than the recession coming from the economy, right? Manufacturing, but rather this coming from government actually shutting the economy down.
Well, that's true. Basically, government shutting down for the COVID virus accelerated what would have happened if we would have done nothing. In other words, if we would have done nothing, we'd have, 1,200,000 tests, and nobody'd be coming out of their house, and we'd be in, it would be 100% shut down if we had done nothing by now. So the government was basically, trying to shut down for a short period of time so that we can open up, as well as we don't want to overwhelm the healthcare system, because COVID is, unlike say the flu, COVID overwhelms your healthcare system with incredible speed. And so in that sense, yeah, government slowed it down. However, the counterfactual of doing nothing, we would be 100% shut down right now at doing nothing, because the virus would have been just completely out of control. But in terms of the other question, state and local government, kind of related there, state and local governments, cutting back 1/8 of in state government, 1/7 in local government, and that's them being optimistic about they think they're going to get some federal relief. If they don't get the federal relief, it's going to be one more nail in our problems, because they'll start laying off more and more workers, and then that'll spill over the rest of the economy.
So we've got another question here about income distribution. So you talked a lot about differences between spending for wealthy households versus low-income households, differences across education. What do you think are the implications now and in the future for the income distribution in the U.S. and even across rural urban areas?
God, that's a great question. In the short term, because of the way the $1,200 check per adult, $500 per child, had an income cutoff, and it was fixed, and the $600 unemployment insurance, we probably have, because of transfer payments, a reduction in income inequality between April and the end of July, which we're going to have to worry about now that we're pulling out that stimulus is going away. That's probably now we're going to get this could be crushing, because the lower income groups without that kind of transfer payments, first they have to work. If they have to draw unemployment insurance, it's going to be virtually nothing. And if they do work, they're going to have to work on the front lines, unlike us professors and academics and researchers who can work from home. So we're going to have just we could have a massive blow up in inequality if we don't do the kind of stimulus that we need. The stimulus would help them the most, help the lower income groups the most, but it also would help the economy the most.
So a lot of this is a little negative. What do you think is the positives, right? Can anything positive come out of this? So I know even where I am, actually in my little town, we now have a designated drinking area where we can actually now walk around with drinks, which the adults really like right now, get them outside. There's more patio seating, which I also really like. Are there positives to the economy that could come out of this?
Well, there could be. So one, as a lot of us know, the rate of new firm creation and the share of employment in small businesses has been declining since the 1970s. And since we find that there are very important small business, new businesses for innovation and net job growth, that's had an adverse effect on the economy, and it's also reduced the amount of competition in the economy. We have a lot. Like if you look at the price markup over marginal cost, it's growing, and when you have less competition in the economy, those of us who believe in markets, that's problematic. One of the things, so with that background, so what I'm saying is we haven't had this since the 70s, but what if this ends up that we lose a lot of small businesses and other businesses? I don't want to lose them, but let's say we do. That creates an opportunity. That's the Schumpeterian kind of situation where low-valued uses could be switched over into high-valued uses. We could realign the economy to what's most productive instead of these zombie firms who could only stay in business because they could borrow money at 2% for the last decade. So if this creates some sort of Schumpeterian kind of creative destruction, I could see we come back 5-6 years ago and look at a much more dynamic economy than what we would have had if we would have just kind of kept going along, creeping along, and zombie businesses able to stay in business and not really getting rid of the low productivity firms. So I think that's the best. Other things, I think one of the things is I think we've learned a lesson for at least a couple generations that the next pandemic, we will react much better to it.
So the next, sorry, were you done?
Yeah, I'm done.
So the next question we have is about stimulus spending. So you talked a lot about the importance of the stimulus to get spending up. But people aren't exactly as free to spend that stimulus wherever they want if they can't go to amusements, if they can't, throw big parties, whatever it is, or if these small businesses still aren't open. So where do you think, if we do the stimulus, where are people going to spend that stimulus money, given the constraints of a pandemic, and what effect does that have?
Well, I think in your question, you answered part of it. Certainly doesn't make sense to give stimulus money to the affluent. First off, even in a normal recession, they're not the best group. But in this recession, they're especially constrained in what they're going to spend it on. I can't. I haven't been to a restaurant in over 5 months. As an example. So basically, the stimulus would need to go to, that was one of the nice things about the unemployment insurance is $600. If you give it to people who have to spend the money, you'll get more stimulus. So you give the money to lower income people, they're going to spend it all. They're forced to spend it all. They're not sitting around saying, unfortunately, I wish they could save more money, but they just don't have the resources to save money. And so the stimulus would have to go to them. And so they'd be spending it on necessities, food and other kinds of necessities.
Do you think they spend it more on those big businesses and those small businesses? So I think we had a news story recently in Ohio about how, Bud Light's doing fine and the big beer's doing fine, but this, your, favorite small little craft brewery is not doing so well. So does it have that kind of reinforcing effect on small businesses?
I think that depends. That's really, so something like you said, I completely agree. I can understand what you're saying. Right now, I can't go to my microbrewery. And so I'm just buying a case of Bud Light and having it every night since I don't have to go to work. I'm working, but you get it. But it depends on demographic groups, immigrants and people in minority neighborhoods and people in urban environments. They could be more affluent and spend a lot on small businesses. So a lot of it depends upon where you're at. Likewise, in rural areas, you just don't have any choice. I mean, a lot of the businesses, just because of economies of scale, you can't have a 5,000 employee air conditioner maintenance place in a small town. You're going to still spend on small businesses. So I'm not worried about that per se. Where I would be worried more about coming out of this is does something like an Amazon gain even further competitive advantage? That's where I'd be more worried about small business.
Thinking about Amazon, do you think small businesses can be more creative than those large businesses and Amazons? Can those small businesses, those craft breweries, right, start delivering, which then pushes back against Amazon now that I have a local bookstore here that started delivering to my home, right? Could we see eventually, as we respond more creatively, especially the small businesses, could we see more pushback against Amazon?
I would be very optimistic to what you said if we had better antitrust enforcement. In other words, where Amazon gains its market power is that it has the technology. It basically has an oligarchy on the technology for their platform to sell the product. And so they're able to charge a high fee for that, which reduces innovation from every other company except Amazon. And because there's no antitrust enforcement as well. On the other hand, if you are successful, Amazon or Google or somebody's going to buy you out. So I think really the best way to I think the best way to increase innovation is to start enforcing our antitrust laws that we haven't really enforced for 40 years.
All right, I think I've hit on all of the questions. If I haven't asked any of the questions, feel free to retype it if I missed any. Oh, I think I see another one. This question is about rural-urban migration. Being the source of urbanization in developing countries, do you think that's going to be affected? Or do you think rural people will, again, begin to migrate back in cities? So how does this affect urbanization? And are there differences between the U.S. and, more developing countries?
Well, I think, a lot of people have said that, because of the virus and population density, people are going to avoid cities because they won't want to live in places where you are in close contact with so many people. And I actually think that there's a counter effect that's coming out of this that people haven't paid much attention to, and that is we're finding also that we can telecommute more. And one of the biggest negatives about cities is congestion and commuting, and whether it's the pollution caused by that or the time. And so on the other hand, that's making cities more livable. And cities already have advantages from agglomeration economies. Those technological things aren't going to go away because of the virus. So that's why I don't think in the long run, we're going to see massive effects in the urban rural hierarchy. Because I see a lot of offsetting effects in there.
So you mentioned there a little bit, people being able to work, and telecommute. So, decades ago, with all this telecommunication ability, people started saying, oh, this is, the death of distance and, the death of cities. We can now live anywhere we want. And I think we hear a little bit of that going on right now, where you start to hear people saying, why live in San Jose when you can live wherever you want, where there's cheaper housing prices. But then you see research, Glazer and others saying, well, actually, with these high-tech industries, it really placed an increased importance on that face-to-face contact and having those face-to-face meetings. Do you think that changes that dynamic at all now that we can't have those face-to-face meetings? Is it true that those face-to-face meetings were really important for the high-tech industry? Or is it something, that they just thought was important, having this face-to-face contact?
Well, they, obviously that part of I already talked about how San Francisco and San Jose have been hit particularly hard. So I think it's somewhat demonstrating how face-to-face is important in many settings. You just can't get around the subtleties of even on Zoom. But I think one of the problems that one of the things when it was, there actually seemed to be a movement out into the countryside. I know there was one in the 70s, was in the first half of the 1990s. And a lot of that, late 80s, a lot of that was being driven by crime in the cities. In other words, people were moving, crime rates were much, much higher, and people were moving away from crime, and, a more slower rural life seemed nice. I think a lot of that, one of the things it will be is less on the firm productivity side and more on the household side, issues such as crime. Likewise, I may find that I can buy a really inexpensive house in Casper, Wyoming, and I can move from San Jose. But the first time I want to have good Malaysian food at a restaurant, I'm going to be pretty disappointed. So there are, or the next time I really want to be able to catch a flight so that I can be in San Francisco for a morning meeting and leave that morning, you're not going to do that out of a Casper. So rural areas, so even if people think that, rural areas still face a lot of the issues that many people don't, they want certain kind levels of services. So I think that's still going to exist even after this.
So you're talking about rural areas. So I know another push for especially rural areas is addressing broadband. So how do you think broadband plays in the importance of adjusting to this crisis and beyond?
Well, maybe that'll be one of the things positive that'll come out of it. In that broadband, I don't think is real important on the. It's nice on the business side, but it's not going to turn on rural communities because the roads go both ways. It makes it easier for you to buy stuff from Amazon, for example. So it's not as clear on the business side, but where it really matters is things like on the household side. You just can't live nowadays without broadband, or you can't live. It's harder to live now. Though we're set up now for that. And we're finding, like even education, not just online, but in regular, without quarantines and schools just in regular session, still so much of your homework is based on being able to go online and downloading this worksheet and being able to look this thing up on online and so forth. I mean, things such as education is so apparent for that. And so I think a lot of that is on the household side. And it would really help with things like education and so forth for broadband. So I'm very much in favor of it. I don't think it's going to turn around the rural business community, but it'll make rural areas much more livable, and on that side might help rural areas.
So you mentioned livability. So how do you think all of this affects quality of life? So we've seen a lot of research on the importance of quality of life over time, even, people saying, people are going to move away from cities, right, with concerns. How does all of this affect quality of life, and how do we address that?
It's hard to say. I mean, because when we're talking about it, some people, again, I'm always one of those who don't expect big changes from one event. You need multiple events, but people have said, well, one of the things we might get is things like Medicare for all. And if you have Medicare for all, one of the reasons why U.S. doesn't look good in business startups is people don't want to quit their job because they lose their health insurance to start a new business. I mean, all sorts of things could happen that could affect, come out of this. That's really hard to say. But I do think what we are going to see is, and I was just as guilty of this as anyone else, is I think people, it might reduce quality of life in the sense that people might be a little bit more skittish about pandemics. They'll take that a little bit more seriously.
So we have another question here. So what are your thoughts on the differences occurring between the current account economy and the growth in financial markets? Is, the growth of equity markets just a function of people moving wealth around to find the best return on investment?
That's a great question. I'm concerned, like a lot of people, in that the innovations in the financial services industry are not the kind of things that affect our quality of life directly. They're basically improving arbitrage, and so it's hard. And it's hard to say how much, by improving the way financial resources can move to their most efficient use, it's hard to come up with a way of, if we can just figure out another slightly teeny better way of doing arbitrage, we'll improve everybody's life. We're kind of about done that. So I'm worried that we definitely have, my point of view is like we definitely do have too much resources in equity markets and the financial markets. And a lot of that has been driven by extremely low interest rates that have meant that whether you're private equity or public equity, you were the only game in town. And there was, because of these incredibly low interest rates. And that was one of the reasons why the Federal Reserve started their slow pattern of lifting interest rates in 2018, 2017. Again, we have to have low interest rates given this pandemic, but one of the unintended consequences has been it has made a lot more money slopping around in financial markets and in private equity.
Great. So that is all the questions. If anyone has any more questions, you can feel free to post them. I don't see any coming up right now.
I actually cannot post questions in the Q&A box. So I just ask here, take advantage of my co-host. So Mark, you look at the data, like the startups, it seems to be doing very well for the past few months. Do you have more details about that? Like what industries the entrepreneurs are creating new businesses, and what's the reason behind that, if you can?
I don't know. That's one of the things, because right now, all you can get off of Fred is just the numbers of people who filled out the form for a tax identification number, and whether they're incorporated or not, but I don't think they are releasing it in real time, things like industry composition and so forth. Because as you know, it could be people creating a bunch of shell corporations, for tax reasons or something, and that's not, that's not what we want. But it has definitely it did bounce back quite a bit.
Okay. I got a follow-up question. I know you already talked a lot about the potential opportunity for the rural areas. You're a rural expert, of course, and I think you mentioned maybe people may still not want to move to Casper, but I'm teaching urban planning department. I'm concerned about like decentralization or urban sprawl. Do you see maybe those like counties adjacent to the big metros going to have a big gain of the population? I mean, they still can drive to, let's say, the San Francisco International Airport, like say for 1 hour. Are this like the opportunity for them to grow their population and perhaps business as well?
I'm a little worried in the sense that how much will climate change regulations that we know will happen someday affect the price of commuting from those kind of places? However, maybe that'll be capitalized in the land values and just offset it. But then you have right now, because statistically, the reason I'm bumbling away here is that because of the way the definition of metropolitan areas you're joined into one if there's 25% cross commuting, basically any place that was adjacent that was growing really fast in the 1980s and 1990s and early 2000s have been incorporated into the metropolitan area, so they're now officially part of it. So in that sense, if you're talking about places that are considered metropolitan, but they're on the fringe of they're really out on the fringe, they'll still be growing for a while. But if you're talking about places literally adjacent, if you're adjacent to Columbus metropolitan area, you're 100 miles away, you're not going to benefit from that just because of the kind of more because of the rule to become part of a metropolitan area. So with that kind of caveat in the data, that's what I'd see.
Okay. Does anyone wants to ask questions by voice? You perhaps can raise your hand and talk with Mark directly.
I've got another question. Oh, sorry, someone raised their hand. Let's let them go. Oh, I don't know how to do this.
Okay, I will.
Wait, I'm figuring it out. Oh. Do they have to unmute themselves or do I do it?
I just allowed talk. I think it probably worked for now.
I think I see Sabyasashi as their hand raised, and it looks like they're muted, and I'm not sure if that's on our end or theirs.
So I clicked ask to unmute. Hopefully the message is there.
Let it go.
Hello?
Yeah, there you go, yes.
Can you hear me, sir?
We can hear you.
Hello? Yeah. I just want to thank for the lecture and answering my questions. Only one question. Hello?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. What do you think about the inequality of the world, that rich and poor will be higher or among the rich country and poor country? What is going to happen about the inequality in the world after this pandemic?
I think probably it's going to be worse, only because a disproportionate share of resources. In other words, it's going to take a higher share of a small developing economy's GDP to take on COVID than it would in a developed country. In other words, developed countries have more resources to apply to that. I think, though, the bigger threat, though, is climate change, is the bigger threat to that. In other words, adaptation and mitigation. It's wealthy countries have so much more resources to do that, and developing countries don't have those kind of extra resources. So I actually think climate change is the bigger threat.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I've got one more question. Mark, you mentioned the different impact that it's had on men and women, where the previous recessions, manufacturing base, affected men more. This one's affecting women more. But we also see a lot more people working from home. We see more flexibility. Is that something that moving forward could potentially help women who have tended to place more importance on having that flexibility? Where do you think the future of work goes in terms of having that flexibility?
It would be great. That would be great if that happened. It might provide more flexibility to women, or show that giving flexibility doesn't reduce productivity. That FaceTime is just a signal and not a productive activity. But one of the things also that we still would have to address is childcare as well. I mean, I think flexibility is good, but to fully get that big push, we have to have a more coherent childcare.
So I see we have, I think, is that another question? I might be saying your name, Sabyasachi. I think you have to unmute yourself again to ask the question.
He should be able to speak, I think, because has the permission to talk. Yeah.
Hello. Actually, I have no more questions. Sorry. I
got
just
it.
had only one question. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Seems like we answered all the questions. Mark, do you have any concluding remarks for your presentation?
No, I'll spare you any concluding remarks, but I really do appreciate the people's tuning in and the great questions and comments. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mark, for a great presentation. I also would like to thank everybody for participating, of course. This will conclude our summer speaker series of 2020. Hopefully I'll see you next year. Bye.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks, everyone.